All right, here we are, another episode of Tools, Talents, and Techniques. I'm joined today by Mr. Keith Carson. Hello, welcome to the show.
Dustin, thank you, my friend. Appreciate you having me.
This is going to be a fun one because at our previous conversation and the things that we've talked about before, I really like the way that you do business and the way you see sales and training. So, without any further ado, could you just briefly introduce yourself and a little bit more about what you do?
Yeah, totally. So my name is Keith Carson. I've been in business development for really over 20 years, held a variety of different roles from carrying a medical device bag in the field, calling on surgeons and hospitals to being the VP of sales of a startup organization and worked with multi-million dollar organizations and then organizations that were starting up and just trying to get their footing. Have got a lot of dents in my helmet over the years. I've learned how not to do it and just continuing to learn about ways in which I can better connect and serve my prospects. So live in San Diego, family of four, got four boys, 17 all the way down to 4 years old. My wife is the most talented one in the family. She's a professional counselor, and we've called San Diego home for the last 11 years. So,
Well, I'm sure her being a professional counselor would come in handy with all those boys running around.
yes, no doubt. Comes in handy for me, bro.
So I want to. I'm really excited. Later on in the conversation, we'll talk about your sales career. But before we get to
Sure.
that, let's talk about the Keith Carson origin story. Where'd you grow up? Like, what were you excited about as a youth, and where'd you fall in line with everything
Yeah,
educationally?
totally. Yeah. So grew up in Mission Viejo, California. My parents actually had moved from Pittsburgh and Buffalo, wanted to find their way out of the snow. And they had made their way to Southern California and have lived there ever since. I was born there and spent 18 years of my life in South Orange County, and then had the opportunity to go to school back east. And I went to school at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina. So here was this Cali kid that freshman year was developing this Southern accent. I was just a total mess, but absolutely loved my time in South Carolina, the opportunity to get exposed to different culture, different people, different food, a different part of the country, and ended up staying there for about 4 years and then 5 years professionally speaking.
Okay, and so what was your major in college? Like, what were your career ideas when you were
Totally.
coming up?
Yeah, started in business. My pops was in business, so I just thought, that's a natural fit. And I was interested in both his business and kind of business concepts and ideas.
So
I got
what
in
was his business?
his business, a printing company.
Okay.
Yeah, so printing and distribution. And he's been doing that as long as I've been alive. And so when I got to school, I can remember, so sophomore year, got into an accounting class, and I'm like, I hate this. This is not something I want to continue to do. I'm very relationship oriented, people oriented. I understand the value of the numbers, but for me, it was not something that I was drawn to. And so I decided, I'm going to kind of minor in business. I ended up taking, I think, 6 or 7 classes in business, but then transitioned into history in large part because I was living in a very historical part of the country, a deep history in comparison to Southern California, a complicated history, certainly, but I was drawn to the stories of history. And I didn't know what I was going to do with that. I did not have aspirations to go on. Oftentimes people be a lawyer or they go on to be a teacher. I didn't have aspirations to do either. I wanted to study something that I was interested in, and history was it. And so really at that time, the things that were kind of formulating in my own heart as it relates to my professional trajectory were largely around ministry. I was very involved with a college ministry in college, and they had a tremendous impact on not only the development of my faith, but just the development of me as a person, as a holistic human being. I was drawn into the work that they were doing and the positive influence and impact they were having on college students. And so at that time in life, the question that I was really asking myself is, what am I most passionate about? And what I was most passionate about was investing into young people.
Did you come from a religious background in your household?
Yes, I did. Mom and dad, it was a common conversation within our household. And we had the rhythms of, Sunday, attending church. They kind of had some really strong, kind of Midwestern values that they raised us with. And so that was always a part of just the ethos of our family and my growing up.
So when you're in college and it's history, and then you're drawn to what was the next step after college, or the end of college going into your
Yeah. So,
professional
so
career?
get this. My pop says, "Hey, listen, I want to try and make a way for you to be able to do, whatever you'd like for a year, right? So you can go off. I thought about being a caddy in Scotland. I love the game of golf, living in a different country, kind of continuing the adventure in some sense. And yet, as I thought about it, I thought, what I really love is investing into young people, as I said before. And so at that point, I decided to go on staff with a ministry to actually support and encourage and help some of the college students on the campus that I was at, which was Furman University, and then had responsibility eventually over 3 to 5 campuses in the Southeast.
So how long were you in this role? Like how long did that
Yeah, five
portion of
years.
your wow.
Yeah, 5 years. So 9 years total in South Carolina. And 4 of those, it didn't take me 9 years to get through school, but 4 to get through school, and then 5 on staff with a college ministry called Campus Outreach.
And then at that time you're doing this, and then did you just come right back to California when you were done? Like how did you make that decision? Or was there a
Yeah,
stop in between?
yeah, it's a good question. Historically, our ministry was asking people to make 4-year commitments. I had worked with Campus Outreach for 5. A new team was headed up to Minneapolis, Minnesota. And as I thought about the trajectory of my own life, kind of what I was being called into, I didn't see myself in what I would describe as vocational ministry. Like I didn't want to go on to be a pastor. And I had exposure to business, as I mentioned to you, all growing up. So I decided at that point I was not going to join the team in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which was a good decision for a variety of different reasons.
No, hold
But
on. My wife's from Minnesota. My wife's from there, but also she lives in Southern California, so she made her decision.
wonderful people, there's no doubt. My blood was too thin for that place. So, I ended up deciding, hey, I want to go into business. And my network was back in Southern California. So my wife and I got married. She's from Florida. And so we got married in South Carolina. And then after that, actually moved to Southern California and was there for a few months before I took my first medical device position.
Okay, and so this was your first go around in sales, I take it.
Yeah, man, no doubt about it. First one, huge. I mean, like multiple interviews to get this position. It was a field sales role. It was actually located in Phoenix. So we were living in Southern California at the time. And I can remember, the biggest obstacle that I had to overcome was helping the organization understand the intangibles and the experience that I had gathered from being in ministry and how that would translate over into medical device sales. I think once they saw my resume, they were kind of like, oh, is this guy really going to be able to make a difference? Is he really going to have an impact on our company? Is he going to be able to sell successfully? And I think had a reasonably successful career at that company for a few years.
Do you recall what, besides getting the job and selling them on that you could do the job, was there anything that stood out were some of the biggest obstacles that you faced in going into that career?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I can remember, and I remember it like it was yesterday, a conversation that I had with the head of HR at the time, and he was very thoughtful and asked some astute questions. But one of the questions that he asked me is, he said, "Is there anything you're afraid of in this position?" And in an interview, it's difficult to be vulnerable, right? To kind of admit and be transparent about your weaknesses. But I remember saying, one of the things that I'm concerned about in this position is rejection, because everybody that I know in sales understands that, you have to get 9 no's before you get, or 10 no's before you get 1 yes. And that was a real concern to me. And I think it was a good opportunity for me to acknowledge and be transparent about my weaknesses, but at the same time, think about ways in which I could overcome those obstacles. So that was a really significant conversation, in helping me think through even a tool that I would need in sales is that how do I position my product or service when there is resistance to it?
When this company that you worked for, what was the sales training like? Was it pretty thorough, or was it like was it a larger company, smaller company?
At the time, they were, I think, 30 to 35 million. We had a team of, let's say, 20 sales professionals.
Okay.
And I was impressed with the training at the time. They did the vast majority of it internally. But my experience with sales training is that oftentimes it's dependent upon the sales trainer and their ability to be able to deliver content in a way that is understandable and digestible. And they did a good job of talking about some of the principles. I soaked it up. I was a sponge, right? Because in some ways, yes, I was doing these things in ministry, but I was learning a whole new language. And anything they told me to work on or to do, I would try and execute and implement it the next day. So they had a robust sales training program, were deeply invested into their sales professionals, although it was a little bit more homegrown. So it was helpful.
Now in hindsight, when you look back and think about the things that you said, from ministry going into the sales job, the things that you told them were reasons why. Are there any things that now you can look at it and like, oh, actually, these things from my college or ministry were really the things that helped me be successful? Is there anything that stands out that you're like, this was more important than I thought it was?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I think one of the things that I have been thinking deeply about lately has been the reality of pressure in the relationship between the seller and the buyer. And it's understandable because you're trying to convince someone. And when I reflect back on my experience in ministry, although there was an element of that you were trying to, just like you might a child, right, persuade them on the way in which they should go, it was certainly not an environment where you wanted to pressure, right? You wanted to force a square peg into a round hole. You had to allow the conversation to breathe. And it's one of the things that I've been learning over the course of my 20 years in business development. When pressure is important and good and useful and helpful, and when pressure is not. And what are the ways in which you need to release that valve and release some of that pressure in the relationship between the buyer and seller? I think as I reflect more on my ministry experience, I learned some of those tools to be able to kind of connect with people in a way that made them feel good and drew them into a conversation, rather than made them go, man, I don't want anything to do with that. Mm-hmm. And I am going to turn away from that conversation. I think mastering the art of that in sales is really, really important.
Yeah. And a lot of that feels like awareness. A big part of
Yes.
it is listening and just being aware of the audience and the situation, and, just being able to develop that and develop that muscle over
Agreed.
time is really important. So you're you're doing the medical sales, and
yes.
And you're in Phoenix. What's the next step after that? Did you reach a culmination of something or another opportunity?
Yeah,
What happened after that?
Calling on 5 to 6 different states in the Southwest, then transitioned on to an opportunity with a larger company, Don Joy Orthopedic, now DJO for a period of time. And then
I've had many of their products. I've had
yeah,
I've torn both of my knees and my Achilles. So yeah, very very familiar.
they do good work in the world. I'm sure you're thankful.
I am. Wish I didn't need them as much
Yes,
as I did.
exactly, exactly. And then I was approached by a friend with regards to an opportunity to start our own medical device company. And so I became part owner in a company called Quinn Medical. And we were developing a spinal orthotic that was going to be kind of one size fits all and allow you to be able to carry less inventory and yet deliver the results that one needed as it relates to pain management, either pre or post surgical. And so I had worked with a colleague and friend in starting that company. And that was one of the biggest lessons of my life, professionally speaking, undoubtedly, because I had to exit that company in about a year for a variety of different reasons. And that valley in my life taught me a lot about business and myself in that season.
Well, because this is your first time starting your own
Yeah.
business, right? And
Yes.
there's a difference between sales and everything,
Yes.
operations, finance, everything. And I don't want to dig too deep, but I mean, you said you learned a lot of lessons there. Is there anything that
Yeah.
stands out that you'd be willing to share?
Yeah, relationships matter. And when you're starting a small organization, you have to be very thoughtful about who you partner with and understand, and for them to understand you and for you to understand them. I think that was a significant lesson for me to learn. I think the second was to be honest about your capabilities. In some ways, I probably didn't have enough dents in my helmet for the position and needed a little bit more seasoning and experience to be able to handle some of the ups and downs of uh, that startup experience. And then the third thing is that focus on revenue. And there's 1,000 things coming at you every day. And your first responsibility needs to be thinking about what is the highest and best use of my time. And if you don't generate revenue and generate it relatively quickly, you don't have a business unless you have a significant amount of capital to fall back on, which we did not. And I think we got distracted by things other than revenue in the year that we worked together.
Well, and I don't want to jump too far ahead, but it's those lessons that you learn now when you're doing the sales training and doing things, you understand it from a different level, you know?
Yes.
And so those dents in your helmet, you don't get dents in your helmet unless you put the helmet on and
Yeah.
start running through things. So that's how you get them.
You're exactly right, man. You got to try and scale that wall.
That's right. So what was the next step after everything, did not end necessarily how you wanted to? What was the next step?
Yeah, next step, man, period of unemployment. And that was formidable in my life. That was probably about 6 to 7 months. And just all kinds of questions about who am I and will I get hired again? And what is the right role and position for me? At the time, we had 2 boys. And so trying to kind of look for coins in the couch to be able to put it all together and make it work. And then was fortunate enough to be able to work with a backup generator company. So worked with them for about a year and a half, called Lofted Equipment in Phoenix. To this day, grateful for the opportunity that they gave me. It was completely outside of what my experience and expertise was in, but a good company and organization, and they made an investment into me. So I was there for about a year and a half. That was in Phoenix, and then was fortunate enough to get back into the healthcare space. And that's actually what brought me out to San Diego. Started working with a company called Therapy Specialists, was their director of business development, then eventually became their director of sales and marketing.
So I think there's a good point to make the differentiate. Like what in your mind how do you separate business development versus sales?
Yeah, great question. I think it depends on the organization some. I believe business development is more macro, sales is a little bit more micro.
Huh.
And when you think about some sales organizations and the way that they're structured, an organization says, here's your ideal client profile, here's your territory, here's your product, go sell. And a business development professional, at least in the waters that I've swam in the past, is thinking a little bit more higher level about the business. Like my responsibility was revenue. I mean, in some ways, I was kind of the chief revenue officer, right? I was thinking about how do we grow our revenue beyond just the ICP that you've told me to call on, but can we generate some other streams of revenue as well? How is marketing helping our efforts in getting integrated with sales, and then as well the customer experience once someone has bought the product or service that we provide? I think the business development is looking for other ways. We even talked about acquisitions at times. Business development is thinking about other ways to be able to grow the business other than just simply calling on prospects and closing deals.
Yeah, that's a great way to distinguish the two. So okay, so now you're in this role and you're leading the sales, leading the business development.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the things that you take? Because now this is one of the times like now you're leading teams, and so now you're in a
Yeah.
leadership position. Was this one of the first times, aside from earlier on in the ministry, that you're leading large teams, or did you
Yeah,
do more of that
it's a
earlier?
good question. And I would say that the vast majority of the teams that I've led have been kind of 10 and under. Did that in ministry, did that when I had started the medical device company. We had brought on about 5 or 6 sales professionals. And then in this organization, therapy specialists, I had really just 1 or 2 people that I was managing
Okay.
at the time. So not very large in scope. I think some of the challenges within that organization was that you're moving from conversations that you're having kind of in the field with other sales professionals to the boardroom. And so that was one of the first times that, with the exception of the medical device company that I started, that was, I mean, we were the boardroom. I mean, it was
Yeah.
small. But in this case, I'm in a boardroom with 9 to 10 other executives, and we've got somebody in operations, we got somebody in finance, we got the CEO, we've got the founder, we've got regional directors. And so it was kind of navigating, how do I sell not only externally, but also internally within the organization and advocate for what I feel like is the best trajectory for us to generate revenue and grow our organization.
Okay. So I know we're almost a half hour in. That went pretty fast, but I want to make sure that we have enough time to go over what you currently do and how you are approaching sales. 'Cause I think
Yeah,
I want to make sure we save as much time as possible for this.
sure.
Could you talk about how when you started your current firm
Yeah.
and more about the general concept of it?
Yeah, so integrated sales solutions. And let me just say that, a few of the things that have really been impactful on my life and really the questions of my professional life, in light of my experience in ministry, I went on to then get a master's in leadership theology and society from Regent College. And the impetus for that was that I was asking these questions about how do I live out of the answers to the deepest questions of my life. And you and I both know, Dustin, as we've been in sales for some time, that um, I don't know that that is something that most sales professionals or sales organizations reflect on. Questions like, why am I? Who am I? How do I ultimately want to be remembered? And when I reflected on my experience in ministry, those were the types of questions that drove my everyday living. And yet, when I entered into sales, the conversations were about targets and numbers and quotas and strategies and competencies and capabilities. And I don't want to diminish those things at all. Those are an important part of ensuring that you achieve results and you're successful in your role. You want to be a master of your craft. But unfortunately, in my experience, I didn't feel like there was enough conversation about like what was going on here, what was going on in the heart. And so that was the impetus for integrated sales solutions. One is that I wanted to kind of push this conversation in my own proximate part of the world to draw people into a different conversation, to see and do sales differently, and then also provide fractional sales solutions, which I feel like is a little bit new in the sales space. You see it in a variety of different departments, within organizations, finance, HR, operations, but very rarely in sales. And so really started my company with those two desires. How can I promote this conversation about living out of the answers to the deepest questions of our lives and how that impacts our approach to sales? And then how can I fractionally help organizations that maybe don't need a full-time VP of sales, but they need the experience and expertise of a VP of sales?
And so you're looking at sales from those deepest questions, and I love that, because there's been so many times where you think about, like, how do you put the community, the client, the people first, and
Yes.
matching in the sales. And so was there, when you look back on your whole career prior to starting your company, do you was there any of those moments where it really jumped out to you that this was needed? Or was there a moment where you're like, oh, wow, there's a gap here?
On the fractional sales side or on the
Yeah.
scene? Okay.
Well, no, actually on both. But I would
On
say, like,
both. Yeah.
on mostly, let's start with, like, leading with the heart, and
Yeah.
understanding who you are, and having a sense of purpose in your career and win sales.
Yeah. I mean, the moment for me was pretty early on, because you have to understand that I was moving from talking to people about their faith, their future, where they were headed. We were talking about some pretty substantial and significant matters of life. And then I went to work with a medical device company, and I was selling foam and plastic.
Hmm.
I mean, that was our cervical collars consisted of foam and plastic. And so I can remember being in my hotel room, on the road, just like journaling and going, this sucks. Man, I have no idea how the answers to the deepest questions of my life impact what I'm doing, showing up tomorrow to talk to nurses about how to actually apply a cervical collar. And I was kind of that combination of like lost, ticked, scared, confused, all of those things. And I'll tell you, one of the things that really stuck out to me, and I don't know if it was a specific moment, although I can envision some of these offices that I called on, one of the principles and ideas that I tried to live by was love my neighbor. And that's not a conversation you have in a lot of sales trainings. How do I love my neighbor, right? How do I love my prospect? And yet it was a way in which I wanted to live my life. And so I can remember walking into doctors' offices and thinking about the implications of what it meant for me to love my neighbor. And that might mean, hey, listen, I am going to take no for an answer, right? If they say, hey, not a good time, don't want to talk to you right now, not a great time for our business to have this conversation, then okay, I want to honor that. I want to respect that. I don't want to kind of press in at least too much. That's maybe a whole nother conversation. Can you accept a no and still love your neighbor at the same time, or at least maybe press through that no? But I can just remember thinking, I'm going to have to sell differently than others if this is a driving principle and idea in my life, right? I might actually walk into a conversation, present my product or service, and then walk out and say, we're not the right fit for you. Let me introduce you to another friend, because that actually would be the most loving thing I could do for that prospect. And so the implications of that concept and idea, I think, are endless in sales, but we're not having a conversation about it.
And so with what you do, and especially where you come, not necessarily just the fractional sales solutions, when you are doing sales training and you're counseling other people, like, where do you start the conversation? Is it really on that level of just understanding who you are as a person?
Yeah, I mean, there's two exercises that I try to do, and some of this is integrated, Dustin, into working on skills, competencies, capabilities, right? I mean, all of those things are so critical to do our job successfully. What I'm trying to do is this idea of smuggling some of these things in to your sales efforts, right? And so there are two things that I would bring up to you and might be helpful for your audience. The first is defining your why, and not just your why related to sales, but like, why does Keith Carson exist?
Yeah.
Why am I put on this planet? Why does Dustin Sutton exist? Why is he put on this planet? And to think deeply about that idea. You don't come up with the answer to that question in 10 seconds. You come up with the answer to that question as you reflect and think about your life, as you think about your future, right? And the other exercise that we do is we actually think about our death. In some cases, I'll have people write up a eulogy. In some cases, I'll have them just write an epitaph, write that kind of 8 to 10 word statement that might be on your headstone. Again, not a conversation that we're having in most sales trainings. But what I'm trying to get people to do, and the reason it's a starting point, is because I want you to think about the end, and I want you to think about ultimate. You have to think about what matters to you. And then the work is, what are the implications of that in your sales efforts, right? If what matters to me is loving my neighbor and doing good in the world, then what are the implications in my sales conversation tomorrow with this prospect?
You mentioned journaling before when you were on the road and you were trying to figure out your why. Is that something that you were implementing in your personal life first before bringing it
Yeah,
into professional?
yeah, totally. Yeah, trying to spend really 30 minutes to an hour every day would probably not be true or right, but as many days as I can to spend that time to stop, look, listen, and receive, and think about the work that I'm doing in the world. Right now, I even have a rhythm where I try to pause in the morning, I try to pause in the afternoon, and I try to pause in the evening. And oftentimes a notebook is close, or, my Evernote on my phone is close, because I'm wanting to stop and take a breath and think about that why, think about my purpose, and whether I'm living that out in the way in which I'm selling.
I feel like that's been so important for it's cathartic in a lot of ways, but
Yes.
also just taking that pause in itself, and then another step, and I'm not putting these things together necessarily, but even taking a pause, going for a walk, doing whatever, but then also as a separate step of writing things down and journaling and just getting it out. There's something magical about it, and birthing those things, those ideas, those feelings into the world that can be so impactful.
Undoubtedly, man. It brings things up to the surface. And I think we've got to do that in order to live well, generally speaking, in our lives, but also to sell better as well.
So, from the sales perspective, and for what you're doing and what you're focusing on, is there a specific niche or areas that you're focusing on for the fractional sales or the sales training? Like, where is your primary focus? Is it the stuff that you've done before, or do you feel like it's universal?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I would say I'm interested in having conversations with individuals and organizations that have sales problems that they're trying to solve, but also care about the way in which they sell. And so the solutions that I can offer can be fractional, right? Where they maybe need specific help on developing a pipeline, or doing better discovery meetings, or thinking through their sales strategy. I can also offer training on the sales side, where I can do training for them, or I work closely with an organization called Aslan Sales Training that's trained 25% of the Fortune 100 companies right now, and they offer robust sales training for enterprise organizations. And I love their approach. It aligns closely with mine. And then sometimes I'll have engagements where I'm inviting people into what I call kind of sales counseling. I think that's a little bit from my wife's experience. You know, it's like, yes, we're going to talk about skills, capabilities, disciplines, all the things that make you a great sales professional, but we're also going to talk about what you're afraid of, what's most challenging, what are the obstacles that you're trying to overcome, even personally, and how do you smuggle in some of these whys of your life into the work that you do. So that's also part of my work as well.
You know, as we're talking, and I'm thinking back with a little bit of PTSD from some of the dents in my head, the dents in my helmet.
Yes, we all
There,
have them.
there was one of my first sales jobs was at Cintas, and the uniforms and facility services.
Yep.
And it was the hardest thing ever. And I remember one of the lessons I took from it, and a coworker of mine told me at the end of the day, we're sweating through our suits and hearing no all day long.
Yeah.
And I asked him, I was like, how do you deal with this? How do you deal with the rejection day in and day out? And he said, attitude and activity. He was like, you just got to stay positive and work hard, and everything else, you can't let anybody else's negative attitude or activity rub off on you. And I remember, I was frustrated, I was hot, and I was like, oh, that's bullshit, And then I thought about it, and I mean, it's been 20 years, and I still think about it all the time. Like, he was right. Now, yeah, there are, like, talk about control the controllables, but really the only things that you have control over are your attitude and activity. Sometimes, like, when it comes to sales training, it's some of those like life lessons that you learn through it that are the ones that hit you to the core.
Completely agree. And I would also add to that, Dustin, we can't do that alone. That's been my experience, is that oftentimes my attitude sucks. And I really need somebody to come in and say, hey, Keith, pick your head up. Think about your long-range goals. Think about your why. And so that's why it's so important that we have these types of conversations, because attitude and activity, oftentimes left to ourselves, it's difficult for us to maintain the right attitude and right activity in order to be successful in our position.
Yeah. So Ryan McCormick, I want to give a shout out to Ryan. He's the one that told me that, but then I found out later that he got that from our friend Adam Kimball. So shout out to those two guys for
that's great, man.
Passing on that wisdom.
It's a good word.
What are you most excited about in your what you're currently doing? Is there anything that's in front of you that you're like, this is what I love, like this is what I'm doing, and this is what I'm most looking forward to?
Yeah, that's a good word, man. One of my whys, I've got a few, but one of them is really to help others. And my greatest joy in the work that I do is when I am effectively helping others not only achieve their goals, but also to sell differently. And I think what I'm excited about is that, when someone comes to me and they see a LinkedIn post or they hear my TED talk about living out of the answers of the deepest questions of your life, and they come to me and say, man, that resonated with me. That was meaningful to me. I get it. I understand it. And I too have felt like a fish out of water at times in sales. And people seem to be longing for a better approach, a more human way to be able to interact with our prospects. And when people are drawn in to those ideas, honestly, a lot of this stuff I do for free, man. I can't, but I would do it for free, because it's when that light bulb goes off and when they go, yeah, man, I now can live out of this idea of loving my neighbor in sales. And it means that I can both be successful and have an impact on the people that I serve.
I think you really tapped into something, and count me as one of those people that the light bulb went off when I, saw what you're
honored.
doing.
Thanks, Dustin.
I mean, count me as one of those people, because I think one of the great things about what you're establishing, and maybe it's through your experience, it's through your work, through your journaling, is that you're putting language around some deep truths. And I think that is very impactful, because when you're saying things that other people are like, yeah, that's that thing that I was that I was feeling, that I was thinking,
Mm,
and you did
mm,
it. Like you put it into words. And that's why I was like, I'm so excited about having this conversation and find out more about what you're doing and what you're offering. So thank you for what you're doing.
mm.
And you mentioned the TED Talk. Tell me about that
Yeah,
experience. How was
yeah.
that?
Yeah, I loved it, man. Loved it. I mean, the challenge for me was kind of taking some of these ideas and being able to consolidate them in a way that people could understand. And so the process was extremely beneficial, so thankful, and the opportunity to deliver it to a live audience. I'm less concerned about where it goes, Dustin, and I'm more concerned about just the process of going through it, right? Nick Saban, the process, don't focus in on the results. Philadelphia 76ers.
Mm.
I don't know how that's working out for them, but it's this sense of like, hey, I got so much joy in that journey and it was so beneficial for me. And I hope opens up some other doors to be able to speak. But at the end of the day, it was being able to take all this stuff that was going on up here and be able to have a process to say, hey, this would be a good way to articulate it in a language that the world can understand.
Yeah. Well, before we take off here, I want to open up the floor. Is there anything that you want to share with the audience? Where to find you. We'll include all your links in the show notes, but I wanted
Yeah.
to make sure I give you this opportunity to share anything
Yeah,
specific.
thanks, Dustin. I really appreciate it, man. Honored to be on your show and grateful that you've taken an interest in these things, man. So my website is seesalesdifferently.com. And on there, you can learn about my fractional sales solutions. And then you can find some information on the integrated sales forum. In the integrated sales forum really is at the heart of some of the work that I'm doing with regards to seeing and doing sales differently. And then, one of the things I've thought about in sales, Dustin, I don't know if you're this way, I'm kind of this way. I realize that not everybody's ready for a conversation, but sales begins with a conversation, right?
Mhm.
And I come into that conversation going, I don't know if I can help you or not, but the only way in which we can find out is by having a conversation and learning a little bit more about your needs and your business. And so it kind of begins with that. I do a sales assessment with organizations or individuals to get them to think a little bit more deeply about the way in which they're selling and things they need to do as a sales organization to be more successful. So that's a great place to start with me.
Yeah, and if you're looking for Keith Carson on LinkedIn, I have the double bell, so I get all your notifications.
Yeah, thank
So
you.
so I'm one of those guys. But yeah, man, I think what you said before, even your sales approach previously, where you listen to somebody, and maybe what you were selling isn't the best fit for them, but
Yeah.
you still try to get them to a solution. I think that is something that we talked about, and I think that's something that I try to implement in in my life, not just
Mm,
in the sales and business development, but like, okay, we're here for a reason, and
yes.
there's a reason for us having this meeting, having this conversation.
Purpose.
There's a purpose there, and
Yeah.
then like, what is it that's important to you, and how can I get you to? Hopefully, it's with my firm, and we offer something, but in the end, I'm going to try to get you to the right place, and I think that's what it's all about.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Investment into that individual and organization, whether or not it benefits you.
Yeah.
Completely agree, Dustin. I think people respond to that and appreciate it.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, Keith, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah,
Thank
man.
you for everything that you're doing. This was a lot of fun. And yeah, I look forward to next time.
Yeah, appreciate you, bro.